Hi, and thanks again, everybody. Right after 9/11, I got really angry. And I remember sitting in the house of my good friend Jimmy Weldon in Burbank, California one night, talking about the events of 9/11 and how so many people don't understand America. And he said to me, "Why don't you write a speech about it?" And I did. And Jimmy has been giving it 2 or 3 times a week ever since. I posted it here on YouTube a couple of years ago, but in audio version only. And a friend suggested that I just sit down with you right now and tell you what that speech was all about and see if you agree. There has been a lot of talk since 9/11 about the number of people who hate America. I guess some people do. It must have taken a powerful lot of hate for those terrorists to have done what they did that terrible day. But I like to think that for everyone who hates this country, there are just an awful lot of other people who don't understand us, and for some of them, it's excusable. You see, if you live under the thumb of a dictator, or in a third world country, or in any nation that belongs to the Government of the Month Club, you cannot understand how this country, this America, has been able to survive using the same basic political blueprint since the late 1700s. Oh, we've evolved incredibly. We've had riots in the streets, 4 presidents assassinated, scandals in Washington. We've had contested presidential elections. We have fought in unpopular foreign wars, and we've even seen brother kill brother in our own divisive civil war. But through all of that, we have somehow managed to lead and feed the world. We've added 37 stars to our flag, and we've seen Old Glory planted on the surface of the moon, and you know what? Some people still don't get it. They don't understand. And far too many of those people call themselves Americans. Now, to really understand the America of this moment, the America of right now, you have to go back to when those shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. You have to go back to the Revolutionary War. We forget today that it was nearly 6 long, bloody years. More than 11,000 people killed, maimed, mutilated, herds and flocks scattered to the wind, homes and hamlets burned, men hanged for treason, and everyone on both sides just wanted it to get over. Now, it's instructive that during that war, the ragtag, underpaid, underfed, underclothed, underhoused American army under George Washington never really won that many spectacular battles. But in some ways, Washington wasn't worried, for he knew that the only way to continue to fight the awesome army and the might of the British Empire was to hit and run. I'm talking about retreating, to walk away and fight another day. Finally, as you know, it did get over at Yorktown, and that would not have been an American victory had not part of the French fleet shown up at the last minute. You see, it was as if we had the ball and were up by 1 point, and then the clock ran out. And because the Revolutionary War ended that way, it would take 2 long years to finally win the peace at a conference table in Paris. Now, whom did we send to negotiate? The original odd couple. Acerbic, acid-tongued, opinionated, loud John Adams, who maybe more than anybody else in colonial times ate, breathed, and slept the cause of liberty, and a man who was the best-known civilian in the world at the time. He had been an American overseas. He came home to help out during the Revolutionary War. That man was Benjamin Franklin. But it's interesting that as much as we honor Franklin's name today, John Adams thought Ben Franklin was the worst possible choice. He thought Franklin was a dirty old man, a womanizer, someone who could not wait to go to Paris, but not to negotiate, to party. But worse still, John Adams thought Ben Franklin was, in his words, an apologist. Adams said that every time he made a strong point with the British in the negotiations, grandfatherly old Benjamin Franklin would stand up and say, well, maybe we better talk about this. Well, that bad guy, good guy approach worked, and the American cause prevailed. But while they were seeking to secure our freedoms in Paris, we almost lost it here at home. Now, after Yorktown, Washington had moved his still underpaid, underfed, underclothed, underhoused army to an encampment on the Hudson River called Newburgh, New York. Today, it's about an hour north of New York City. And almost from the moment he arrived, he had heard rumors that some of his top aides were about to leave, to abandon ship, if you will. They were willing to settle for half a loaf of liberty in return for just being home. Washington didn't blame them. He didn't want to be there either. But George Washington realized something that his men hadn't thought about. And that is, if the army fell apart, and word of that got to Paris, then Adams and Franklin and John Jay, who had joined them, couldn't negotiate from a position of strength. He was unwilling to let the fruits of the Revolution die on the vine so close to final harvest. And because of that, George Washington had repeatedly written to members of the Continental Congress begging them to not renege on their promise to reward the heroes of the Revolution, but it had been to no avail. Finally, one day, Washington's worst fears were realized. One of his aides told him that half his army was about to mutiny if the paychecks did not arrive. Well, ironically, and thank God, Washington got a letter from a member of the Continental Congress that day. Historians don't tell us much about it. The only thing we know is it probably said, hang in there, George. Once the treaty is signed, the soldiers will be paid. So armed with that letter and nothing else but the incredible strength of his personality, George Washington called an emergency meeting of all of his officers and top aides in a long wooden building called the Temple. He called it for that night. The Temple was the chapel there at Newburgh. Now, we know that Washington arrived last. We know he walked slowly to the front, probably because he dreaded public speaking. He really did have rotten teeth. And he went to the front and turned around, and in a near whisper, he reminded his men of the precious nature of freedom and the need for continued patience. Then he remembered the letter he had. He took it from his pocket, held it up to read it, but he couldn't read it. Not because the light was bad, or he feared the reaction of his men, but George Washington's eyesight had failed, and from a tiny pocket he took some little wire-rimmed glasses and put them on, and there was a gasp in the room. Now, today, we think nothing about someone wearing glasses. But in George Washington's time, for a man as powerful as he was to wear glasses was the ultimate sign of weakness. And Washington spoke again. My friends, you who have been with me through the long prosecution of this war have watched me grow old and gray. But now I find I am nearly blind. He read the letter with great difficulty, put it and his glasses back into his pocket, and walked out. He did not say another word. Now, historians who tell us about that night tell us that every man in that room would write in his ledger or diary that when George Washington left the Temple, the seasoned, battle-hardened soldiers there wept. For they had seen their father figure, a man who had led them to victory, a wealthy Virginia plantation owner who begged their case before the Continental Congress and who froze and starved with them at Valley Forge, humble himself in their eyes in the cause of liberty. And they somehow instinctively knew that if George Washington were vulnerable and fragile and frail, so vulnerable and fragile and frail, was freedom. Something else the historians tell us is that after that night, there was never again a call for mutiny. So, the Army stayed together. The British signed on the dotted line. The American delegation came home. The soldiers got paid, and then guess what? For nearly 3 long, excruciating years, the indecisive Continental Congress sat in low gear, spinning its wheels, doing next to nothing, squandering America's hard-won freedoms. Finally, a group of progressive delegates approached the leadership and told them that if America were ever going to be a separate and distinct nation, if she were ever going to find a place in the world, if the dreams of the patriots were ever going to be fulfilled, something had to happen now, because the window of opportunity was about to close. So delegates met behind closed doors in the heat of a Philadelphia summer, without benefit of air conditioning or right guard. And when they gathered for their first meeting, they asked themselves this daunting question: what in God's name do we do now? For they had been given no less a task than the creation of a new nation. And we forget these hundreds of years later that these young, wild-eyed radicals could have done anything they wanted. The ball was in their court. It was their decision. And if they had asked the wrong questions, if they had made mistakes, we would be living with the consequences of those mistakes today. But they didn't. They did the right thing. They looked at nations of the past that had flourished and failed, and they asked themselves what happened. They looked at great revolutions, and they realized that most of them had, after the final battle, imploded. And they realized that the euphoria that comes with victory must be channeled and harnessed, or it will be short-lived. They looked, of course, at the Magna Carta, that great charter. But it had been forced on King John by a bunch of wealthy, land-owning barons who were only concerned with the rights of the royalty, and the common man be damned. For up until that point in history, the classic definition of governmental power was that it rested at the top, usually in the hands of one man or one woman, and it trickled down slowly, and far too often never. And what these young guys did for us that summer in Philadelphia, these mostly young men, most of them lawyers, one trained as a shoemaker, what these men did for us was to simply turn the world upside down. For they would write in black and white that power belongs to the people. And when it came time to design the game plan for their new American government, they used the one geometric figure that cannot implode, it cannot collapse on itself, the triangle, with an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. And they gave each branch the power and responsibility to spy on the other two in a unique system of checks and balances. And they fixed it so that no branch of the American government could operate alone. And they prayed that when all three operated together, something magic would happen.